In this video, I'm going to talk about the membership of the House of Lords today. And by today, I mean late April 2025. There are currently 4 categories of membership, and this should be unsurprising, considering that in Britain we tend to do piecemeal constitutional reform. These 4 categories are the Lords Spiritual, the Life Peers, the Accepted Hereditary Peers, and the Accepted Office Holders. These last 2 categories of people will be removed by the end of this parliamentary session, which is probably going to be in the summer, certainly by the autumn. There's a bill going through at the moment to do that. Members of the House of Lords are given a writ of summons from the monarch. They are asked to be personally present at a parliament in Westminster with the prelates, great men, and peers to give and treat your counsel upon certain arduous and urgent affairs concerning us, the state, and defence of our united kingdom and the Church. So who are the prelates, great men, and peers? I will start with the Lords Spiritual, who are the prelates. These are 26 Church of England bishops. The Church of England is the established church in England. An established church means 2 things. Firstly, that the laws of the church are the laws of the land, and this can be seen when, recently, the parish of All Saints Spring Park in Croydon appealed against a decision of the church commissioners, and this appeal went not to an internal church court, but to the Privy Council. The Judicial Committee of the Privy Council is one of the courts of the country, essentially. It's not specifically ecclesiastical. The second aspect of being an established church is that there is some membership for that church in the House of Lords. There are other aspects too, and I'll just say at the start, I will be glossing over and simplifying a fair bit of the history, because otherwise it will just be far too complicated, and this video will be more like 2 hours long rather than what I'm aiming for. There are currently 42 Anglican dioceses, each one headed by a single bishop. 41 of these dioceses are in England, though. The Bishop of Sodor and Man doesn't sit in the House of Lords, but instead sits in the Legislative Council of the Manx Tynwald, the Manx Parliament. Historically, in terms of bishops, they all used to attend the House of Lords. Their number increased slowly over the years, with 6 new bishops being made after the Reformation. After that time, for, say, about 150 years, no new dioceses were made. It was only in the start of the 19th century that new dioceses, with new bishops, started to be made again. And this increased the number of Lords Spiritual. It was only when it came to the creation of the Bishopric of Manchester in 1847 that it was decided that the size of the Lords Spiritual in Parliament should be capped. I suppose it made it easier to create more bishops in the future, knowing that you weren't increasing the number of bishops in the House of Lords. And so it was decided to cap the number of Lords Spiritual at the 26 that there were in 1847. The way this was done is that 5 dioceses, 2 archbishops of Canterbury and York, and the bishops of London, Durham, and Winchester are members ex officio. The remaining 21 are the 21 Church of England bishops who've served the longest. So, when you're made a bishop, you'll have to wait for a few years before enough bishops ahead of you retire, before you end up being one of the 21 and receive your writ of summons to the House of Lords. There is a caveat, though. When the Church of England decided to start ordaining women to the episcopate, that is, making women bishops, this was in 2015, there was a fear that it would take quite a long time for any significant number of female Lords Spiritual to come about, due to the queuing system. So, the Lord Spiritual Women Act 2015 was passed, which provides positive discrimination in favour of women. Now, when there's a space in the 21 Lord Spiritual in the queue, and if there's a woman who is a bishop but isn't one of the 21, then she will jump ahead of all the men in the queue. This was originally only meant to last for a decade, so it would have expired this year, but it has been extended for 5 more years. There are other kinds of bishop in the Church of England, but these are not in the queue to be members of the House of Lords. These are generally assistant bishops in some form or other, area bishops and suffragan bishops, assisting the diocesan bishops in their diocese. But there are also flying bishops, as they're colloquially known. They minister to dioceses that reject the ordination of women, and there are not very many of them. They tend to be either conservative evangelical or conservative Anglo-Catholic. But as I've said, none of these bishops are in the queue to become one of the 21 Lord Spiritual. Bishops must retire at 70, but they can retire earlier. For example, Justin Welby did quite recently. Historically, and this is the last time I shall say this, when it comes to the historic components of this talk, I will be very brief. Historically, before the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536-9, many of these monasteries were summoned to the House of Lords. This meant abbots and priors, but also some abbesses were given writs of summons. It's not known to me whether the abbesses attended in person, whether they sent representatives, or whether they didn't attend. It was quite common at this time for Lord Spiritual not to want to attend the House of Lords. The House of Lords at this time was mainly about taxation, and the clerics preferred to be taxed in the convocations, which are ecclesiastical gatherings. Even though there was at that time a majority of spiritual members in the House of Lords, in terms of actual numbers, you need to be careful in assuming that just because you could attend meant that you did. Interestingly as well, the prior of the Knights Hospitallers ranked as the Premier Baron of England before all the other Lords Temporal. These positions, or these spiritual positions, were eventually abolished and dissolved, leaving us with only a few bishops, whose number then grew slowly to the 26 we have today. There are 2 other parts of the Church of England that were established, which now are not. That is, the Church of Ireland and the Church in Wales. The bishops of the Church of Ireland used to attend the Irish House of Lords, and after the Acts of Union, which united Great Britain and Ireland together, some representatives of theirs attended the new United Kingdom House of Lords. At the time of union in 1801, there were 4 archbishops and 18 diocesan bishops in the Church of Ireland. They didn't all attend at once, but instead attended on rotation, with 1 of the archbishops every 4 years, and 3 of the 18 diocesan bishops every 6 years. But this was skipping over any of those bishops who were already members of the House of Lords, and there were a couple. Charles Agar was Viscount Somerton, and was elected to be in the Lords from the time of the Union. I'll go over that later. And Thomas Plunkett eventually inherited his father's title of Lord Plunkett, and so his bishopric of Tuam, Killala and Achonry was skipped over after 1854. There were some reforms to the Church of Ireland from 1833 onward, which merged 10 of these dioceses together. In the end, instead of waiting every 4 years, if you were an archbishop, to be a representative Lord Spiritual, you only had to wait 2. I say years, really this was parliamentary sessions, but parliamentary sessions tended to last about a year, and still do. Ultimately, the Irish Church Act 1869 disestablished the Church of Ireland, effective 1st of January 1871. All in all, there were 76 rotations of the Irish bishops before disestablishment. As a postscript, Robert Eames, Lord Archbishop of Armagh, was given a life peerage during his tenure in 1995 and sat in the House of Lords for just over a decade, whilst also being Archbishop of the now disestablished Church of Ireland. When the Church in Wales was disestablished in 1920 under the Welsh Church Act 1914, delayed to the end of the First World War, it so happened that all 4 Welsh bishops, the Lord Bishops of St Asaph, St David's, Llandaff and Bangor, were part of the 21 Lords Spiritual at that time, and so they were all removed in one fell swoop. Again, as a postscript, Rowan Williams was Archbishop of Wales before becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, but, to my knowledge, no Welsh bishop has sat as a member of the House of Lords in any capacity since 1920. Moving on to the second category of people who attend the Lords today, the life peers. The life peers, it should be noted, take up a vast majority of the spaces in the Lords. Life peerages generally are innovations. Peerages had become essentially always hereditary by the early 19th century. The House of Lords at that time was the highest court in the land. For most things, it was everything except Scottish criminal cases. So there needed to be legal expertise in the House of Lords. There was a fear that there simply wasn't that legal expertise, and the only way at that time that you could be appointed to the House of Lords was with an hereditary peerage. This formed a bit of a difficulty. It was difficult to ensure that there was enough expertise in the House, and whilst you could get that by appointing skilled judges to be hereditary peers, you would be permanently increasing the size of the Lords with no guarantee, still, that there would be any skilled judges in it. Lord Palmerston was Prime Minister at that time, and he asked Queen Victoria to try to appoint a peer for life. This is a peerage that cannot be inherited by anyone. The person appointed was Sir James Park. The problem is, there's no real polite way to suggest to the people acting as judges in the House of Lords at the time that they might need some help. Politically, this was slightly mismanaged, and although Queen Victoria did make Sir James Park an eminent judge, Baron Wensleydale, the House of Lords Privileges Committee examined this new life peerage and decided in 1856 that whilst it might entitle Sir James to be called Lord Wensleydale, it didn't give him a seat in the House of Lords and a writ of summons. Following on from this, though, the House of Lords was happy to pass an Act of Parliament called the Appellate Jurisdiction Act, and there were several such of these acts passed as the decades went on. These acts enabled a limited number of life peers to be created for eminent judges to act as judges in the House of Lords. The key is that the Appellate Jurisdiction Acts always had an upper limit. Initially, it was only 4, but over the decades went all the way up to 12, which is where the number sat at the creation of the new Supreme Court in 2009. There are still some people who have these law-life peerages, and they remain members of the House of Lords. Life peerages for the masses were introduced under the Life Peerages Act 1958, and these are the life peers that now comprise the vast majority of members of the House. If you are ennobled today, this is what you'll be given a life peerage under, and the title will not descend to your children. In a very brief sketch, the Prime Minister is the person that has the political initiative to ennoble peers, but the Prime Minister customarily asks the Leader of the Opposition for some nominations as well. There's an independent body called HOLAC, the House of Lords Appointments Commission, which was established in the year 2000. This both vets the names that are put forward by politicians and also is occasionally asked to appoint some crossbench, politically independent members. It should be noted that these are the prime sources of membership of the Lords, prime ministers of the day and leaders of the opposition of the day. There are some parties that seem to have informal deals, such as Plaid Cymru and the Green Party of England and Wales, which seem to have a solid, consistent number of 2 peerages at any one time. However, the main thing to note is that being appointed a peer is a political act, and there's probably no better example than the number of peerages that the Liberal Democrats received when they were in coalition in government from 2010 to 2015. No new peers were appointed for the Liberal Democrats until very recently, and then only 2. The Democratic Unionist Party received a few peerages as well, under the time that they supplied confidence to the Conservative minority government in 2017 to 2019. There are also some jobs that appear to attract life peerages, either upon appointment or upon retirement, but again, this is not hard and fast. Upon appointment, it seems as though the President of the Supreme Court, which took over from the Law Lords, always gets a peerage. The Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales appears also to get a life peerage upon appointment, presently the Lady Chief Justice. And the Master of the Rolls, however, the head of the civil courts, seems to only get one on retirement. Furthermore, any minister appointed from outside of Parliament is given a life peerage to enable them to be questioned and critiqued in the Lords. Otherwise, the private secretary to the Sovereign, the chief of the defence staff, the head of the civil service, the governor of the Bank of England, the Speaker of the House of Commons, and the Archbishops of Canterbury and York tend to get life peerages upon retirement, but there are exceptions to at least 4 of these. There seems to have been an idea that Supreme Court justices were to be given peerages after retirement. Supreme Court justices were originally the old law lords, so they were already peers. When new Supreme Court justices were appointed, they were not given peerages, and they have still not been given peerages even after retirement. They are given the title and style of Lord or Lady, but that's not a peerage, even though it sounds like one. Even if they were given peerages, they could only take up their seats in the House of Lords if they were not a sitting judge. Sitting judges are now excluded from sitting in the House of Lords. There are other ways in which membership is affected, both voluntarily and involuntarily. There's a committee of the House of Lords called the Conduct Committee, and this examines breaches of behaviour by members of the House. It produces reports that can be read online and can recommend either nothing if the person investigated has done nothing wrong, a minor apology or paying back expense money if there's a minor infraction of the rules, but it can also recommend suspension from the House of Lords for a set period of time, and even, in extreme cases, expulsion. These powers were given to the House of Lords under the 2015 House of Lords Suspension and Expulsion Act. Previously, the House of Lords could only suspend members up until the end of the Parliament, so until the next general election, and it couldn't exclude people permanently. Whilst suspension has been recommended several times, expulsion would only have been recommended once, but that peer, Lord Ahmed, who was due to be expelled, instead retired voluntarily under the 2014 House of Lords Reform Act. Many peers retire under this 2014 Act. Retirement is permanent, and otherwise they serve until death. Peers can also go on something called leave of absence. This was introduced in 1957, the year before the Life Peerages Act. Leave of absence is when you signify to the House of Lords that you're going to be away for quite some time. And it's good to do this if you know you're going to be abroad or too busy to participate in the House's activities. Because if you don't attend for an entire session of Parliament, so that's essentially for an entire year, then you will be involuntarily removed, again under the House of Lords Reform Act 2014. Only a few peers are removed in this way, and they tend to be very ill. In 2010, there was an effort under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act to do all manner of things. One of these things was to ensure that all members of the House of Lords were based for tax purposes in the United Kingdom. This was 4 years before retirement was possible. There were provisions in the Act that allowed members who wanted to remain based for tax purposes outside the United Kingdom to permanently retire from the House of Lords. Only 5 peers chose to leave. One of them, Baroness Dunn, was from Hong Kong and remained based for tax purposes in Hong Kong. Her ladyship was given a life peerage before the handover when Hong Kong was British. I think that's slightly unfair, that she's stayed put where she is and is now been removed. The next category of peers are the remaining hereditary peers, who are by-elected under the House of Lords Act 1999. The House of Lords Act 1999 sought originally to remove all hereditary peers from the House of Lords. But politically, this was undoable. It was instead decided to decimate their number from roughly 750-ish to 75, plus an additional 15. Nothing's ever easy with this, or straightforward. These 75 plus 15, so these 90 spaces, were filled by hereditary peers. The original idea was that kicking out the hereditary peers would be stage 1 of a 2-stage reform. Unfortunately, stage 2 didn't come to pass. There was a provision in the House of Lords Act that made these spaces permanent. If any of the 90 hereditary peers passed on, then by-elections would take place to fill these spaces with other hereditary peers. The way in which these by-elections are done is slightly convoluted. I mentioned 75 plus 15. The 75 was a decimation of the hereditary peerage in proportion to that number that were Conservative, Crossbench, Lib Dem and Labour at the time in 1999. The electorate for these spaces are the remaining hereditary peers who sit for that party or group in the case of the crossbenchers. And the 15 I mentioned were elected by the whole House of Lords, so the whole House votes to fill these spaces. They were originally meant to be those that were deputy speakers in the House of Lords, but now they're just an additional number of hereditary peers. These by-elections were postponed during COVID and have been postponed since July 2024, while the government brings through the bill I mentioned earlier that will abolish all of these seats. Because there are not very many Labour or Lib Dem hereditary peers, the electorates for their by-elections are very small, being as small as 4. You might wonder why peerages are hereditary at all. Initially, wealthy landowners were summoned to Parliament and its predecessor institution, the King's Council, to approve of taxation on all wealthy landowners. wealth in this era, after the time of the Norman conquest, being largely connected to land. This was quite similar to the way that the king had wise men around him to give advice in Saxon times, and there are examples of royal servants holding land in return for performing certain duties before the Norman conquest. Originally, this list of people was simply enough wealthy people. They may have been all of those who were given honours, as they were called, by William the Conqueror, after he conquered England in 1066. But, after a while, there were some weak kings, such as Edward II, and it was during the times of these weak kings that the aristocracy, as they eventually became, started to ossify. After the reign of Edward II, the list of people to whom writs of summons were given became stereotyped. That meant that the same summons was sent out every parliament. The aristocracy won the right to attend every parliament in their lifetimes. Since they were summoned as holders of property directly from the king, and since they were summoned to the court of their immediate liege lord from whom they held the land, per baroniam, the connection between property, specifically this holding of a piece of land from the king per baroniam, and the right to be summoned to parliament became connected. Since property was inheritable, this right to be summoned, which slowly detached from that of holding any property at all, also became hereditary. It was in the reign of Richard II that a new peerage was made afresh by the royal prerogative. I mentioned the royal prerogative previously, when Queen Victoria tried to use it to make a life peer. Richard II issued letters patent, as in open letters, readable by all, for the steward of his household. For the good and gratuitous services which our beloved and trusty knight, John Beauchamp of Holt, steward of our household, has rendered to us, and the place which he has filled for us from the time of our coronation until now, and which he shall be able to hold for us in future in our councils and parliaments, and also for the noble and trusty race from which he descends, and for his magnificent intelligence and circumspection, we have preferred the said John to be one of the peers and barons of our realm of England, willing that the said John and the heirs male of his body issuing shall possess the estate of baron, and shall be called Lords Beauchamp and Barons of Kidderminster. This new peerage was made like the old, hereditary. Beauchamp was rewarded this for being at the centre of a personal administration which King Richard was operating during much of 1387. This was the practice of granting hereditary peerages by letters patent from 1837 until 1965, when Harold Lord Wilson of Rievaulx, as Prime Minister, largely stopped the practice, instead preferring to grant life peerages only. This meant that from 1958, when the Life Peerages Act was passed, until 1965, when Lord Wilson of Rievaulx took over as Prime Minister, it was possible to be either granted an hereditary or a life peerage. In this period, it might be fun to say that Alan Sainsbury, chairman of Sainsbury's Supermarkets, was ennobled and picked a life peerage, whereas Simon Marks, who was chairman and managing director of M&S, picked an hereditary peerage, Lord Marks of Broughton. Other members of the Sainsbury family have received life peerages, whereas the Marks family have simply inherited their hereditary one. However, soon that hereditary peerage will grant no special membership of the House of Lords. Baroness Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, had 3 more hereditary titles granted. One, the customary earldom, going to former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who ironically passed the Life Peerages Act. The customary viscountcy to retiring Speaker of the House of Commons, George Thomas, and a viscountcy to Willie Whitelaw, effectively her Deputy Prime Minister. Both viscounts had no sons, so it was politically easier to grant them hereditary titles at a time when that would have entailed automatic membership of the Lords. And this is quite similar to Ramsay MacDonald's choices for peers in the 1924 Labour government. This was the first Labour government, and the Labour Party, opposed then to the principle of hereditary peers, still needed to appoint some members of the House of Lords so it could pass legislation. The 3 men Ramsay MacDonald chose to put forward as peers all had no sons, so de facto the baronies Olivier, Thompson and Arnold only lasted for the lives of the grantees. Queen Elizabeth II continued to grant hereditary titles to the royal family. These hereditary titles did grant membership for members of the royal family to the House of Lords before 1999. Prince Charles, as Prince of Wales, even made 2 speeches in the chamber, although, following custom, they were non-controversial. The first was on sport and leisure, and the second was on voluntary service in the community. His brother, Prince Andrew, was introduced to the House of Lords as well as Duke of York, but made no speeches, and their brother, Prince Edward, was not even introduced to the House of Lords as Earl of Wessex, although he was given that title several months before the general exclusion of hereditary peers. Members of the immediate royal family have sat in the House of Lords and its predecessor institutions back to the Witan. The last royal peer to speak in the House of Lords was Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who made 4 speeches in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The 2 speeches of his, which were recorded on video, are on my other channel, which you can see. And I would like to thank the Parliamentary Recording Unit for providing me with copies of that footage. The titles in different peerages, those of England, Scotland, and Ireland, each gave the holder a right to be summoned to that respective House of Lords, or, in the case of the Scots, the unicameral Parliament and the Estates. After the union between England and Scotland in 1707, Scottish peers elected 16 of their number, each Parliament, to be representatives of the whole peerage, while the new British peers had automatic seats, as did the Old English peers. Shortly after the union, the Duke of Hamilton, as Premier Scottish Duke, was granted the British title Duke of Brandon, and this led to a political controversy that nearly shook the Union apart. Predicated on the exact wording of the Acts of Union and the number of Scottish peers to sit in the House, the House of Lords ended up deciding, by 57 votes to 52, that no patent of honour granted to any peer of Great Britain who was a peer of Scotland at the time of the Union can entitle such peer to sit and vote in Parliament or to sit upon the trial of peers. This both stopped the Duke of Hamilton from sitting under his Scottish title because of his British one, and stopped him from sitting under his British title because of his Scottish one. This seems manifestly unfair, and I think it is, but it's best to think of this as a kind of impeachment trial. The whole House of Lords voted, political feeling was running high, and the opposition Whigs tried to force it away from being a legal issue by refusing to consult the judges. Think of this in the same vein as American impeachment trials, where the Senate votes. That's essentially the same system, borrowed across the Atlantic, as was used here. The cases aren't exactly similar, of course. It wasn't an impeachment. But I think that's the best thing to liken it to in the modern era. It was only after 70 years, in 1782, that the 8th Duke of Hamilton and 4th Duke of Brandon finally received a verdict from the Lords that overturned the earlier decision and enabled His Grace to take his seat, place and voice in the House. These Scottish peerage elections went on until the passing of the Peerage Act, 1963. This enabled all Scottish peers to take their seats, instead of having to elect 16 of their number. After the union with Ireland in 1801, Irish peers elected 28 of their number for life or bankruptcy, with by-elections replacing their number. These by-elections continued on until 1922, when the Anglo-Irish Treaty effectively abolished the officers who organised the by-elections. Those representative peers who were sitting in the Lords continued to sit on, with the last one, the 4th Earl of Kilmorey, passing away in 1961. When the Peerage Act, which did several things, was passing through Parliament, there was an amendment to try to allow all Irish peers to take their seats in the House of Lords. That was roundly defeated. Undeterred, the Earl of Antrim and 11 others issued a claim in 1965 to the House of Lords to try to restart the by-elections. Unfortunately for them, they lost their case, the argument being that there was no more Ireland for them to represent. It was therefore ruled that the right of Irish peers to by-elect representatives amongst themselves to the House of Lords was abolished, and this was deleted from the Act of Union by the Statute Law Repeals Act, 1971. The final thing that the Peerage Act did, that I shall mention in this talk, is that it allowed women hereditary peers to sit. Customarily, women did not sit in the House of Lords. I've mentioned previously the abbesses, although, as I've said, I don't know whether they did sit or not, but they were certainly summoned. In 1919, Viscountess Rhondda, who succeeded to her title by special remainder, tried to sue to enter the House of Lords based on the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919. The purpose of this act was that if it was only on account of someone's sex that stopped them from being appointed to or holding any civil or judicial office or post, or from exercising any public function, then that disqualification would be removed. Viscountess Rhondda was originally accepted, but then the Lord Chancellor, Lord Birkenhead, reconvened the Privileges Committee and gave a judgment against her in 1922. This judgment pointed out that because women didn't sit in the House of Lords, the special remainder to her ladyship's viscountcy did not mention the ability to have a seat, place and voice for her, but only for her father and any of her legitimate heirs male of the body, any of her sons or male descendants. The Peerage Act of 1963 reversed that. On the eve of the passing of the House of Lords Act 1999, all hereditary peers, male and female, but not counting peers of Ireland, could sit in the House of Lords. This included royal peers, but it must be noted that many peers didn't attend at all. In fact, some didn't attend for generations. If you want to see the final hour or so of the House of Lords with all the hereditary peers, again, head over to my other channel. I've requested footage of that too from the Parliamentary Recording Unit. Today, there are 87 hereditary peers still receiving summons due to their titles, but this is an exception to the general rule in the House of Lords Act 1999, that no one will receive a writ of summons by virtue of an hereditary peerage. By the end of this parliamentary session, that exception for these 87 will be removed, and that includes, amongst others, the Earl of Kinnoul, who is currently the convenor of the crossbenchers. The final category of people, or person, who has a right to attend the House of Lords is also to be found as an exception under the House of Lords Act 1999. This is for those holding two great offices of state. The first office is that of the Earl Marshal and Hereditary Marshal of England. It's hereditary with the Dukes of Norfolk, and the Earl Marshal is responsible for the College of Arms, which regulates heraldry, as well as state ceremony, such as the recent coronation and the state opening of Parliament. The other great office of state, the Lord Great Chamberlain, is inherited in an immensely complex way, and has in fact been inherited by one of the peers who is amongst the 87 who have been by-elected to remain as representatives of the hereditary peerage as a whole. Lord Carrington is both one of these remaining hereditary peers who holds a great office of state, and also one of the remaining hereditary peers by-elected under the House of Lords Act. He fulfills the last two of these categories. The Lord Great Chamberlain was originally responsible for all palaces, and then, over time, merely the Palace of Westminster, where all the machinery of government has settled down, really by probably the 13th century. Lord Wilson of Rievaulx, when he was Prime Minister, rearranged the control of the Palace of Westminster to be shared between the Speaker of the Commons, the Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain, now the Lord Speaker, and the Lord Great Chamberlain, instead of just the Lord Great Chamberlain himself. I believe the Lord Great Chamberlain now controls the more ceremonial parts of the Palace of Westminster, such as the Norman stairs that the monarch takes up after entering the palace to go to the robing room, which the Lord Great Chamberlain also controls, and where he assists the monarch to get changed into His Majesty's parliamentary robes. Then also the Royal Gallery, the grand corridor where the monarch and others process. It used to be that the Lord Great Chamberlain and the Earl Marshal, not to show disrespect to the monarch, walked backwards so that they weren't turning their backs on their king or queen. But Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II allowed them to walk forwards from around 2004. The Lord Great Chamberlain used to be hereditary with the Earls of Oxford, but ran into female inheritance 3 times in its history, each time choosing a different way to deal with that. Firstly, it just went with the male line, then it went to just the senior female line, and now it is inherited as land used to be inherited in England, by all women equally. What was originally a 50% share was now split on one side to go all the way down to 1/100th of a share, or 1/20th in some cases. When there were only a few co-heirs, it was decided that it would be the turn of one co-heir for one monarch's reign, and then the other co-heir for the next monarch's reign. That principle remains, except that all of the various co-heirs decided, in the early 20th century, to elect one deputy to exercise the office between 3 different families, and that these would rotate every monarch's reign. In the reign of Elizabeth II, it was the Marquess of Cholmondeley, who continued as a member of the House of Lords until the accession of King Charles. Now it's Lord Carrington, who was already a member, and in the next reign it'll be the Marquess of Cholmondeley again, before going on to Baroness Willoughby de Eresby's portion. While these two officers are being removed from the House of Lords, it seems as though they will retain some form of special access to Parliament, to enable them to better perform their duties. It is worth mentioning the office of Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain, which for all intents and purposes used to be an ex officio member of the House. The Lord Chancellor was the presiding officer of the House until 2006 and sat on the woolsack. Technically, the woolsack is outside the House of Lords, but in practice, Lord Chancellors were given peerages to enable them to take part in the debates and discussions of the Lords. Otherwise, all they could do was just call the votes. Practically all Lord Chancellors for centuries were given peerages until, again, the 2005 Constitutional Reform Act shattered the role of Lord Chancellor, and it is now a subsidiary title of the Minister of Justice in the House of Commons. This leads to some slightly odd bits of ceremony. During the state opening of Parliament, the Commons are summoned, but the Lord Chancellor, who is an MP, is already by the monarch. Anyway, this is a result of the government at the time trying to abolish the post, but being unable to, fully. The only exception in recent centuries for a Lord Chancellor not being given a peerage was that of Charles Yorke, who was appointed Lord Chancellor on the 17th of January 1770. He was appointed Lord Chancellor despite disagreeing with the administration that he was then going to serve. King George III insisted and pointed out to him that, although he might politically disagree, this was his one chance to be Lord Chancellor. There are conflicting stories, but the most poignant states that, after being appointed, Yorke went to his brother's house. He met the leaders of the opposition, whom he supported, and then felt enormously shameful that he'd betrayed his conscience by accepting the office. He then sadly ended his own life 3 days later. His final act as Lord Chancellor was to refuse to sign the letters patent that would have made him Lord Morden. In the 20th century, it became customary for viscounties to be awarded to Lord Chancellors, but after 1965, they were mere life peers. Of the current roughly 820 members of the House of Lords, 24 are Lords Spiritual, because 2 sees are vacant. 6 are law life peers, whose titles were created under the Appellate Jurisdiction Acts. 87 are the accepted hereditary peers, accepted from the general exclusion under the House of Lords Act 1999, and the vast majority, more than 710, are life peers, whose titles were created under the 1958 Life Peerages Act. That's about 86% life peers, about 3% Lord Spiritual, and about 10.5% hereditary. And it should be noted that, while there are limited numbers of Lord Spiritual and hereditary peers, and limited numbers of life peers under the Appellate Jurisdiction Acts, there is no upper limit to the number of life peers who can be appointed. This has been the case since 1387, when King Richard used the royal prerogative to prefer the said John Beauchamp of Holt to possess the estate of Baron. The fact that the House of Lords cannot control who becomes a member of it ultimately led to its political destruction at the hands of the monarch and the government. In the next video, let's discuss the political process and the political effects of getting a noble.